Hi guys, this is Andrew Burgess from Nettuts. This is the 6th screencast in our Ruby for Newbies series. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at operators in Ruby and why they're very different than operators you'll find in other languages. By operators, I'm talking about things like the plus operator for adding, say, two numbers together or concatenating two strings. Or something like the square bracket equals operator that allows you to assign to a key in a hash, or just square brackets, which allow you to get something out of a hash. These are the kind of things I'll be talking about, and we'll talk about why there's a lot more to them than meets the eye. So let's hop into it right now. So let's pop open a terminal and explore what I'm talking about. We'll pop into an IRB shell, which you know stands for Interactive Ruby Shell, IRB, and here we can just do some Ruby execution. We'll start with something basic like 1 plus 2. We get 3 back, which is what you'd expect, but what's really going on here? Plus is not the name of just the operator we're using. It's actually the name of a method that we're calling here. We could write this like this, and let me write this out and then we'll discuss exactly what's going on. Remember method calls that we talked about last time? What we've got here is the number 1 is an object, the dot, which is the second part of a method call. Third is the method name, in this case just the plus sign. And fourth is the parameter list, in this case just the parameter 2. And you can see that calling the plus method on 1, passing it the parameter 2, returns us the object 3. We can do the same thing with strings. If I have the string Joe, and I say dot plus, Joe dot plus, and pass it the parameter Smith, we get Joe Smith. The plus sign is actually a method. It's the same thing with a lot of the other arithmetic operators and other things too. And we're going to look at how we can build these into our own classes in Ruby. So let's move the terminal over to the side here. And I've got this lesson 6 Ruby file here on my desktop, which is an empty file. And here we'll just open this up in Vim. And let's get to work. So what we're going to make here is we'll make a fridge class. And we'll define the plus and minus operators to mean something adding or taking something away from what's in our fridge. This is just a silly example that can help you maybe get your head outside of the box on how exactly you might use plus and minus and how we can define them to mean whatever we want them to mean. This might not be the best use of them, but it shows you that they can have meanings apart from what you're used to them meaning in other languages. And the neat thing about this is that in other languages, we can't define what the operators mean, at least not in any other language I've tried. But in Ruby, that's possible. So we're going to have a class called fridge. As you might remember, we need to first create our constructor function, or our initializing function. It's called initialize. We want it to take 2 parameters. We want it to take an array of beverages and an array of food. These are the items that will start off in our fridge. Now we don't want to require these, so I'm going to put their default values after an equal sign after their name. So what this is saying is if beverages and food are not supplied, empty arrays will be assigned to their values. In here, we're just going to say beverages equals beverages, and the instance variable foods equals foods. And let me just pluralize that. And there we have that. Okay, so now let's say def plus item. It's that easy, really. We're just defining what plus method on our class means. By default, we get the Ruby syntax that will allow us to do, we're going to have our fridge instance plus food instance. And this is what we'll do to mean add something to our fridge. But we could make it mean whatever we want it to mean. In fact, we could even overwrite this in the built-in Ruby classes if you wanted to. That's what makes Ruby such a powerful and cool language. Of course, we're not even discussing meta side of this, as in what should you do and what should not do, just best practices as a Ruby programmer. It's not a wise idea to override what it means to add two numbers together. But for this example, we'll just keep doing what we're doing here. So we want to add an item to our fridge. Well, we have to see if it's a beverage or a food first. And we could go into this in a bit more depth to see, well, if it's not a beverage or a food, then let's raise an error and that kind of thing. In this case, we'll just assume if it's not a beverage, then it is a food. So what we'll do is we'll say if item dot is a beverage. Now we haven't made the beverage class yet, but what this does, the is a method, is a method that every object has, and it takes one parameter, which is the name of a class, and it basically returns true if item is a beverage, or it will return false if it's not. We can try this in the terminal. If we say 1 is a fixed num, you can see we get that true, but 1 is a string is not true. Meanwhile, if I say test as a string is a string, that's true, but test as a, let's say, object, that's true as well, because string inherits from object. But if we say test is a time, that's false, because test is not from a time class. Okay, so if item is a beverage, then at beverages.push item, we'll push it into that array. Else, we'll push it into the foods array. And then we can put end, and there's our plus method. Now let's define our minus method. What does it mean to take something out of the fridge? Well, for our purposes, that just means take it out of our food or beverages array. So first we're going to have to check to see if the item is in the array. So we'll say we'll start with beverages. If beverages dot include item, so if the beverages array includes this item, then we will say at beverage dot delete item. The delete method on arrays allows you to remove an item from the array. At the same time, it returns that item. So because of the way Ruby works, we don't have to have any return here. We can just say delete the item from the array, and it returns that from the array at the same time. So if it's not in the beverage, we'll assume we're asking for a food, and so we'll take it from there instead. And so there we have our basic plus and minus operator methods. If up here, we'll just add it to the right array, and here we subtract it from the right array and return it. Now all we have to do is create our beverage and food classes. So we will say class beverage. We'll initialize something, and we have to take a name. Of course, these. And in here, we'll just say at name equals name and at time equals time, because it makes sense that we would want to know what time we put something in our fridge. And then we'll create another one here, and we'll just call it food, and that'll really be the only difference. Okay, so now that we've saved these files, let's come back here, load this file into IRB, and give it a try. So I will move to my desktop, open up IRB, and I will require the lesson 6 file, and you can see that that worked since we get true. Okay, so we'll make a fridge. We'll just call it F, and we'll say fridge.new, and we get a fridge instance there, and you can see that the beverages array and the foods array are both empty. Okay, so now let's create a food. We'll start with the beverage, actually. Beverage.new, we'll call it water, and undefined local variable or method time. And of course, I forgot here that time isn't actually a variable here. We have to say time.now. That's the problem with this. And we have this in 2 places here. So we'll just change this to time.now. Unfortunately, that means I've got to exit IRB here, if I can get my typos sorted out. And then we'll just require lesson 6. There we go. And while we're at it, I'm just going to require the pretty print library, because we're going to use that just to look at our fridge item in more depth. That just allows you to print objects in a more readable way. Slightly more readable. Okay, so let's create our fridge again. Fridge.new, and now we have our fridge objects. So now let's create a beverage. We'll say beverage.new, and I forgot to give it the name. There we go. So now right here you can see we have a beverage instance, and this is the representation of a Ruby object. So you can see right now we've got the name property and the time property that it has. Very good. Okay, so now let's say f plus water, and now we've just added it to the fridge. And now if we look at the fridge here, and better yet if I do a pretty print on the fridge, you can see that our beverages instance variable has one item in the array, which is our water beverage. Let's create a food now, and we could call this, and we'll just say bread equals food.new bread, and then we'll say f plus b, and actually I didn't call it bread, b, I called it bread. There we go. Food.bread. Excellent. And now let's create another beverage. We'll say juice equals beverage.new orange juice. Let's do that. F plus juice, and let's create one more food. We will do eggs equals food.new eggs f plus eggs. There we go. And now if I just clear this and do a pretty print on the fridge, you can see that we have two beverages. One's water, one's orange juice, and we have two foods, bread and eggs. Now the problem with our implementation here is that if we want to get these back out, we have to have a way to identify that very object. So for example, I can't do f minus bread. That's not going to get anything back. I have to use the bread variable, which points to that bread object in memory, and that way I can get bread back. It might be better if we let item be a string here. So for example, if we say we'd have to really restructure this, but if we could say, does the beverages array include an item whose instance variable name is bread? That's what we would have to do. And that might require some iteration. Anyway, the point of this wasn't to make a functioning fridge, but just to at least show us how, see now if we use f minus bread, and now if we look at the fridge, you can see here that we only have one food left, which is eggs, and the bread is gone. So that's an interesting way of using plus and minus operators, and you can see how you can use these, like it might be more practical if you have an account class, that if you have an account and you have information with the account, one of those things is the balance. And when you do a plus or minus operation on the class, or on an instance of class account, it just forwards that, basically. That method calls the plus or minus or whatever method on the number instance balance, which is one of the instance arrays. So you could give that a try. What we'll do now is let's look at another one that's kind of neat that you may use, and that's the square bracket notation. But let's come back here and explore it with the built-in Ruby classes first. Let's say we have a hash that we're going to call person. A hash, as you might recall, is denoted by curly braces. These are very similar to JavaScript's object literals, except that we can't assign with dots as you would in JavaScript. What you use is square brackets. So we say person.name equals Joe, or not person dot person square bracket, age equals 20, that kind of thing. And I think I've made a mistake there because I had an extra square bracket there. But anyway, there, and then you can see if we say person, we get name equals Joe and age equals 20. These square brackets are actually shorthand for another method, and this one is even more hard to believe it or not, than the plus operator that you saw earlier. We could actually do this by saying person dot square brackets equal sign, and then passing in two parameters. The first one is the key, so in this case we can say last name, and the second one is the value, which we could say is Smith. And this, in effect, is the same thing as saying person last name equals Smith. Now, I don't think anyone would disagree that this second version looks a lot better, looks a lot more natural in coding. But the first version gives you a lot more power because you're calling a method. You have control over what goes on inside that method. And what Ruby allows us to do is have the prettiness, the syntactical sugar of the second one, while having the power of the first one. So here, if I say person.lastname, you can see that it was indeed assigned to Smith. And if we look at the person, it's just another parameter, just like, or another key value pair in the hash, just like these other two, which we assigned with the syntactical sugar. So let's look at building these functions. And the thing about building these functions is it's really hard to use them when you're just trying to come up with an example. It's hard to use them in a way that isn't already covered by a hash or some of the other built-in Ruby collection objects. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make, I'll just add this to the bottom of this file, we're going to make a club class, or a board of directors kind of thing. We'll just call it class club. And what we'll do here is use the square bracket operators in a way that isn't maybe the best API design, but gives you an idea of how they work and how we can use the functionality of having a method call instead of just a straight assignment with that operator. How we can use the idea of having a method in there to change what we do based on the input or based on the state of the object. So let's define our initialize function here. We don't need any properties. I'm sorry, we don't need any parameters. We're just going to have a members instance variable, which is going to be a hash. So let's start by defining our square bracket, which will take a role. This is the get operator, if you will. This is how we would get something from a collection object. And in this case, we're just going to forward this to the members hash that we have, to its square bracket method. So when we want to get something from our club, we'll get it from the members role, the related key value pair in our members hash, just like that. However, things get more interesting when we want to define our setting operator. So this takes two parameters, one of which is the role, and in our case, one of which is the person who is getting that role. And the way this is going to work is if we assign one person to a role, that's fine. But there are some roles in our club that might have more than one person. And so if we assign a second person to that role, we don't want them to overwrite the first person. We want them to be added to the list of people who have that role. This might not be the best way to do this, but we're going to do it this way. This does make it kind of hard later to, reset it completely, and we'd have to add other functions to do that. But anyway, this will work for now. So first we have to find out if this role is blank. So we're going to say if members role dot nil question mark. That is a built-in method to Ruby objects that basically says, is this nil or does it actually have a value? If it's nil, then this has never been assigned to it before. So we're just going to say members role equals person. And remember, this uses the built-in square bracket equals method on the hash. This is technically the same as calling members dot equal role person, just like that. Okay, but what if it's not nil? Well, then it could be either two things. It could mean we have one person assigned to this role, or we could have many people, or more than one person assigned to this role. If we have just one, then it should be the case that members role is a string. If members role is a string, then we need to convert it to something other than a string. We want to add something. We have to add a second person, the one we're trying to, this person value. We have to add him or her to the members, to this specific role. But this role is a string, so what are we going to do? We're going to turn that into an array instead. So what we'll say is members role equals, and we'll open an array here, and we'll just put 2 items in this array to start it off. We'll say members role, which is going to be the person that's currently in that spot, and then we'll add person there as well. That's nice. And then otherwise, if it's not nil and it's not a string, that means it's currently an array. So we'll say members role.push person. There we go. All right, so here is our little class, and I can't forget to add my second end there. So here's our little club class. Let's come over here and give it a try. We'll exit this, hop back into IRB. We'll require lesson 6, and we want to make a new club that we'll just assign to a variable C. So there we go. We have our club, and I can already see that we're going to have problems because members, although I don't know if that would actually trip us up, I misspelled that. So we're going to play it safe and start this over. All right, so there we go. Now we have our club here. And all you can see is we've got our one members instance variable with its a hash. So let's say C, and we'll start off by putting in a chairman, and we'll just say chair equals Joe. So then let's add a, we'll just say board member for lack of a better idea, or we'll say engineer, just to be a bit different here, and we'll say John. Now if we look at C now, you can see that members has 2 items, 2 key value pairs in this hash. Chair is Joe, engineer is John. Joe and John are both strings. But if I say C engineer equals Sue, then engineer here becomes an array. And so now, if I decide to use get, John and Sue are an array. So it started out as nil, or not even being defined. Then we put in 1, and it became John as a single string. We added another engineer, and now John and Sue in an array. So this shows us, is a kind of a simple example of how we could customize what appears to be just a simple assignment to do different things depending on the state of our function. And it allows us to be a lot more flexible in our Ruby objects, as well as allow them to be just as expressive as the built-in Ruby objects. Really, there's nothing that, no kind of special syntax, as you might think of a lot of the operators in other language, for example in JavaScript or PHP, or pretty much any other language that I'm aware of. You can't create a custom class that defines its own custom action when the plus operator is used. But that's what we're doing here. You can't create your own custom actions for using the square brackets in JavaScript, but that's what we're doing here. And that's what makes this so cool. So that is what I wanted to show you in today's lesson of Ruby for Newbies. I hope you've enjoyed it. In review, we've talked about how methods are really behind the operators in Ruby. And we talked about calling those methods with or without the syntactical sugar, and how it really doesn't make a difference to the code behind Ruby, behind the code you're writing, but you can write both intensely functional and very user-friendly, viewer-friendly code in one spot in Ruby. And finally, we talked about using those operator methods in our own custom classes and how we can build those. What I have down here at the bottom is a list of all the operators that are defined as a class in Ruby. You can see at the beginning we have the arithmetic operators, plus, minus, multiplication, division, modulus. We talked about square bracket equals. The double less than sign is... It's got a couple different names, but basically, it's kind of like, it basically does the same thing as push in in arrays, and I believe in strings it does the same thing as plus equals. I'm not sure on that one, but it's used in a lot of different classes to mean different things. And then most of the rest after that are assignment operators. Not assignment operators, equality operators, for greater than, less than, equal, that kind of thing. And then the last three are bitwise operators, I believe. And all of those can be redefined in your own classes as custom methods. So now we come to our Ruby resource, in which I point out a usually free Ruby resource for your consumption. This lesson, I'm recommending you check out rubyweekly.com. As you can see from the tagline, it says Ruby Weekly is a concise, once-weekly, free roundup of Ruby news. Every Thursday, you'll get this newsletter, which will give you a little bit of Ruby news from the week. This is put up by Peter Cooper, who runs or is part of the Ruby Inside blog. And I'll throw this in here that if you enjoy JavaScript, he also has a JavaScript weekly newsletter, which I believe a link to that is just further down on the homepage here of Ruby Weekly. Well, that has been Ruby for Newbies Chapter 6. I hope you've enjoyed this screencast. Talk to you soon.